Hey, it's the weekly live stream of Ministry to Muslims, and you're probably here because you want to get equipped to reach Muslims around you with the gospel of Jesus Christ. If that's not why you're here, we welcome you anyway. So thank you for being with us. I'm your host, Eric, and we have also our Q&A specialist, we'll call her Carm, and she will be taking your questions after we hear from the speaker. So let that just be a note to you now. As he is speaking, just be thinking of questions and post them in the chat. We're looking for questions. We're not so much looking for comments. But anyway, so this is your chance to interact with the speaker. That's why we do this live. Okay, and so let's, by the way, today we have a guest who will also be a guest at our Strong Tower conference. And that our Strong Tower annual conference that our ministry puts on is September 9th to 11th. And so that's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And registration will commence on June 1st. You can start signing up then. That's coming Wednesday. So I want to remind you of that. So that'll be Samuel Green. There he is. And he's got a coat on as if it's winter. Well, that's because he's coming from down under where it almost is winter, I think. But he's going to be speaking tonight on the Jerusalem Church, Paul, and the origin of the Gospels. So Samuel Green is one of the founders of Answering Islam, the website. Also, I think it's engagingwithislam.org is his website. He's created a ton of pamphlets and books, and he has done a lot of debates. So he's quite schooled, schooled, you could say. He's very into this realm of dealing with Muslims, whether it's polemics or apologetics. And so we look forward to hearing from him. Sometimes we get more into the Quran, sometimes more into the Bible. Well, tonight it's going to be more Bible. So we'll let him go free here in a minute. And so if he's ready, we'll do that right now. Are you with us here? Can we hear you, Samuel?
Yes, I can hear you. Right. It's great to be with you, Eric and Carm. Thanks for having me on your program. Well, today I want to look at the subject of the Jerusalem church, Paul, the Apostle Paul, and the Gospels. And what I'm wanting to do here is, let me just get this up here. I'm wanting us to think through this issue, because when we're talking with Muslims, they often repeat the arguments of liberal scholarship regarding the Gospels. In particular, that the Gospels are later products, they were written much later, and they're products of the Christian community, and they're not from the apostles or their companions of Christ. And this would be one of the arguments that you may hear from Muslims, or certainly that Muslims themselves will be told by their leaders, because as you know, Muslims are very often taught to reject the Bible. And so this would be one of the reasons that they're given, and that is liberal scholarship has proven that the Gospels were not written by the apostles. They come from, decades later, from the 80s, the 90s, wherever, and that they give these dates. Now, we need to have an answer to this as Christians for a couple of reasons. One is we need to be able to show our Muslim friends the truth. And so when they say to us the Bible was written very late, the Gospels were written late, we need to have an answer to say, well, it's not. And we also need to know this for our own faith, because we want to know, about the Gospels as well. What can we tell about when they were written? And so that's what I'm wanting to consider today. Now, very often when we do this, we consider early church fathers like Papias and Irenaeus, who wrote on this matter. And so you can read about them in books like this. This is Eusebius, his ecclesiastical history, and he will give you all these quotes from Papias and Irenaeus on the New Testament, telling us, what these authors were saying at these dates. Papias was the earliest one that we have, and he's around the year 110, 120. And so we have him talking about Matthew and Mark. And so they're certainly named by that stage. We don't have any evidence to the contrary, but they've got names. But what I want to do today is I don't just want to look at the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius and Papias and Irenaeus. I want to look at the New Testament itself, because I believe there's a lot that we can tell from the New Testament. And of course, that is the earliest documents there are. And so I want us today to look at these and see what they actually tell us about how the Gospels were written and their origin and their possible dating. So, one of the best statements we have in the New Testament comes from the start of the Gospel according to Luke. And Luke writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account." So here we have actually Luke spelling out his method and what he's doing. And it's very helpful for us. So let's have a look at what this says. Luke has clearly explained his situation and method. Now, what's the situation? Well, there's actually many people writing the accounts of Jesus' life. When Jesus came, he is a powerful figure. He is powerful. When he comes, everything changes and people are writing about his life. And we know that because we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we've got multiple gospel accounts. Luke says here that he is writing an account based on the eyewitnesses and the servants of the word. So that's the description he gives of the people to whom he's got this information from. They are the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so the question for us is, who are these eyewitnesses and servants of the word? And again, I know this might sound simple and obvious, but I want to let the New Testament itself explain itself so that we can see how we can give an answer to this. Well, in Luke and Acts, the apostles of Jesus are specifically identified as the witnesses and servants of the word. So that this title that Luke puts here of eyewitness and servants of the word are actually used of the apostles themselves in his writings. So you've got here, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And that idea of the disciples of Jesus being witnesses, it's repeated on many occasions, as you can see through here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's very specific. So Luke not only tells us that he got the information from the eyewitnesses and servants of the word, he specifically tells us who these people were. Let's move on. What Jesus is doing here actually has an Old Testament understanding to it. And we need to understand this. So have a look in Isaiah. He says, "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me, no God was formed, nor will there be one after me." So here is God speaking to the nation of Israel. And what are they spoken of? How are they described? They are God's witnesses. Look at the next verse. "I have revealed and saved and proclaimed. I am not some foreign God among you. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, that I am God." Now notice Israel's role. God reveals, God saves, God proclaims, and Israel are witnesses of these things. And finally, "Do not tremble, do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim this and foretell it long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there any God beside me? No, there is no other rock. I know not one. So the apostles of Jesus are witnesses, and they are fulfilling Israel's role. So the idea of God doing things in history, God acting in history, God acting in the Exodus, God acting in the life of King David, God acting in the life of Daniel. All of these were times when God acted in the nation of Israel, and Israel, through their prophets, were witnesses to what God had done in history. And so we see this now being taken over, or not taken over, but continued by the apostles of Jesus, who are the witnesses to what God has done in Israel. Now, Luke records that the apostles, the 12 apostles, conducted their ministry from Jerusalem. Again, I'm not going to look all these up, but I've given you the references there, and hopefully you are familiar with these. But in the beginning of Acts, the apostles of Jesus based themselves in Jerusalem. And we see that in the book of Acts, but we also see the apostle Paul writing about it in the book of Galatians, where he talks about a visit to Jerusalem to visit Peter and Paul and the pillars of the church. And what we see is that the character of their witness began with John the Baptist, and then they speak of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So we've just been told that they're witnesses, that they are the witnesses of what God has done, and that this was what the nation of Israel was to do. This is Israel's role. And so the apostles of Jesus are doing this. And so what is the nature of this witness? Well, it begins with John the Baptist, goes through to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So we see this when they need to appoint a new disciple, a new apostle. After Judas has died, they need to appoint somebody else. And now they take Matthias, but notice the prerequisite for who they can select. It says, therefore, it's necessary to choose one of the men who has been with us the whole time the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. For one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. So you can see there that the witness of the disciples that they have as this prophetic role that they have as the nation of Israel speaking to the world, that that it's to begin with John the Baptist and go through to Jesus' ascension. Let me just get over to here. Where are we? There we are. Now, I want us to look at another example of their witness, to actually see their witness in practice. And we see this with the apostle Peter when he's giving testimony at Cornelius's house. Then Peter began to speak. You know what has happened throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached. Notice how he starts with John. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him from the dead on the third day and caused him to be seen. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as judge of the living and the dead. So I just want you to see there's a gospel summary there, isn't it? It begins with John the Baptist and it goes through to his death and being raised from the dead. Now, these witnesses, we can say a little bit more about them because they were taught by Jesus during the time that Jesus was with them on earth. They saw what he did, and they actually continued teaching Jesus' message straight away. Right, so I'll just give you a couple of examples here. Jesus said, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of God has been given to you." And I'm sure you're familiar with that in the Gospels, where Jesus will take his disciples aside and give them teaching. He's teaching them more intensely than he was to the people on the outside. And so we see that when we read the book of Acts, that they just continued this ministry of the word. So you remember in Luke chapter 1, it spoke about the servants of the word. Well, here we see the people as the servants of the word. We, that is the apostles, will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word. And so this is right at the start of Acts. We see here that the apostles are just continuing the ministry of Jesus straight away. Jesus was with them. He taught them for 40 days after his resurrection, and they are now getting on with the task. It may have taken a little while, a few days to get sorted out, but we can see that in those early years, they get straight on with the task. And what is this? Well, they're telling the story of Jesus' life from John the Baptist through to his ascension, and passing on, I assume, his parables and everything else. Now, the title of this seminar is The Jerusalem Church, which we've just been looking at. We've been looking at the Jerusalem church and what they were doing. I now want to look at Paul. That's the second part of the title, because Paul was different. He was a witness to the resurrection of Jesus, but he did not receive the teaching of Jesus. He did not see the acts of Jesus in the same way that the 12 and the Jerusalem church did. The Jerusalem church actually lived with Jesus for several years. Paul was different. And what is very interesting is that Paul actually defers to the Jerusalem church and passes on their witness. Okay, so the Apostle Paul, he's actually working in partnership with them. He's not in competition. He's working in partnership with the Jerusalem church, and he passes on their witness. And it's these apostles in Jerusalem that Luke is claiming as his source. But I want you to see how Paul passes on the Jerusalem church's witness. Here is one of Paul's sermons in a synagogue. And I want you to notice what it covers, but also where it ends. He says, "Before the coming of Jesus, John preached repentance and baptism to all the people of Israel. As John was completing his work, he said, 'Who do you think I am? I am not the one. No, but he is coming after me, whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. Brothers, children of Abraham, and you God-fearing Gentiles, it is to us that this message of salvation has been sent. The people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus, yet in condemning him, they fulfilled the words of the prophets that are read every Sabbath. Though they found no proper ground for a death sentence, they asked Pilate to have him executed. When they had carried out all that had been written about him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in the tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem." Now notice this, they are now his witnesses to our people. They are his witnesses. Notice that Paul doesn't say, "I am a witness of this to our people." He actually says that those who traveled with Jesus and lived with him, they are the witnesses. I just want you to see how Paul is deferring to the Jerusalem church here, and he recognizes that they have a specific witness role and testimony role which he himself does not have. Now, that does not mean he's any less an apostle. It just means that the apostles were working in partnership, and each had been gifted and had been that are their own experiences of God. Let's see how this works itself out. So we see that Paul defers to and passes on the witness of the Jerusalem church. This is the character of his ministry. Now, Jesus said, as we read in the Gospels, he who listens to you listens to me. He who rejects you rejects me. But he who rejects me rejects him who sent me. And so this Jerusalem church, what they say is what Jesus says. Okay, if you listen to them, you're listening to Jesus. If you don't listen to them, you're not listening to Jesus. And so when you hear the witness of the Jerusalem church, this is the Lord. This is what the Lord said. Okay. Now, I want you to see how this works itself out in Paul's life. I want to look now at a few examples from Paul's letters and see what we can learn. Paul planted the church, Paul planted the Corinthian church about 50 AD. That is 17 years after Jesus. That's not that long ago, is it really? Jesus is 33 AD, roughly, when he ascends. And Paul plants the church in Corinth around 50 AD. We can know that quite accurately. And then he writes a letter to them about AD 52. So he writes this letter 19 years after the ascension of Jesus. Now, I want us to look at 1 Corinthians to actually see what's in it, because Paul quotes the Jerusalem church. Look at this, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. Right? What he received from the Lord, that's the way of speaking about the Jerusalem church according to the Gospels. What I received from the Lord, I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." Now, when you look at those words, "This is my body, do this in remembrance of me, this is the cup of the new covenant," these are exactly what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And some Bibles will even quote in the footnotes in Paul's letters, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they'll give you the reference to that. Now, what can we tell from this? Because here is Paul quoting things that he's saying he got from the Lord. He's got these sayings. Well, what can we say? Well, this is actually the earliest New Testament quote. Very often scholars will go to the writings of the early church fathers to find the earliest New Testament quote, but we actually see that the earliest New Testament quote is by the Apostle Paul himself, where he's quoting the Jerusalem church, their witness. And what we see about this quote that he gives is that it is precisely, word for word, verbatim, what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, so this means that the gospel material that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke was in a fixed form, right? It's fixed, and it's being used in the churches by Paul at a maximum of 17 years after Jesus' ascension. I find that remarkable. We actually have evidence that the material that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, word for word, was being used by the church planters in the establishment of churches already within 2 decades. As I said, it's 17 years is when we've got the evidence for it. No doubt it's going to be earlier than this. See, the Gospels were already being quoted. They're already in quotable form. This gospel material was already in quotable form by 17 years after Jesus' ascension. Now, this is the character of Paul's ministry. See, what is it that Paul was actually doing? You know, we read about him starting churches. We read about him going around in the book of Acts and planting churches. Well, what he was doing when he started these churches was he was giving them the testimony and the teachings of the Jerusalem church. And we actually have the evidence for this, because he says to them, remember when I was with you in Corinthians, he says, remember when I was there, this is what I told you. I want to remind you what I passed on to you. And he quotes what we have in the Gospels. Now, I'm not saying that the Gospels were written up in their final form yet, but what I am saying is that the precise material that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is already being used in ministry in the churches that are being planted basically straight away after Jesus. Okay. Let's move on. Now, let's have a look at something else that Paul says here. This is often used against Christians, but it actually proves the exact opposite. Let me read to you. This is where Paul is speaking on the subject of marriage, and he says, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Now, what happens is people look at this, and Muslims will quote this to us and say, look, he's got Jesus' command at the beginning where he says, you know, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. But then later on, he says, to the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord. And so this is just Paul's opinion. And so maybe you've heard this type of criticism about Paul, or maybe you've thought about it yourself when you've read this part of the Bible. But this is showing us something very important. Because when Paul says to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, he's just thinking back to what we have in the Gospels. Remember Matthew 19, where the subject of marriage comes up, and Jesus says, basically, divorce is not on, right? There are some grounds, but what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so that's what Paul passes on to the Christian community. When there are two believers, your marriage stands, and there's basically almost no reason for divorce. He does give a reason in Matthew 19 that you can look up, but you got to stay married. However, Jesus never spoke to the situation when that Paul is in. Paul is out evangelizing, and sometimes a husband might become a Christian and the wife may not, or the wife might become a Christian and the husband may not. And so that's very different to when Jesus spoke to a Jewish community where everyone was practicing Judaism, and he's bringing the Christian message to believers. Paul's in a very different situation, and so he gives a God-inspired instruction for what to do. And he says, in this case, you're not bound. If that person leaves, they can leave. Now, what does this show us? It shows us something amazing, right? It shows that Paul did not add to the words of Jesus. It shows that Paul did not add to the words of Jesus, because if Paul was just going around inventing Jesus' words, which is what people claim, he would never have written what we just read, would he? He wouldn't have said, Jesus says this, but I don't have a command for Jesus here, but I say this as an apostle of God. Right? So you see how Paul is, one, not inventing commands from Jesus. He's not inventing them. He speaks as an apostle to new situations, but when he has a teaching from Jesus, which he's got from the Jerusalem church, he passes that on and says, this is the Lord's command. But when he doesn't have a command, he does not invent one. We've actually got evidence that Paul does not invent the teachings of Jesus, and that when he has to say something that Jesus didn't teach, he's actually transparent. He is transparent and explains the situation and says, I as an apostle speak and give this ruling. Now, I find that exciting. I find that exciting that we can look at Paul's writings and actually see we have evidence that he's not inventing phrases of Jesus. He's not saying here's a new situation. Let's just invent and make up a story of Jesus doing something and what Jesus would say in this situation. They didn't do that. We actually have the evidence that they passed on the teaching and the witness of Jesus faithfully. And when they didn't have Jesus saying something about a subject, they told you that, but still gave their command as an apostle of God. And so in summary, Paul is passing on and using the testimony and teaching of the Jerusalem church in his ministry. And when he doesn't do this, he tells you so. Now, I want to say this is exactly what we do in our ministry, isn't it? I've got Matthew's gospel here, and I'll talk about this in a moment. That this is the teaching of the Jerusalem church, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I pass this on in my ministry. Well, Paul's doing the same thing with exactly the same material. Exactly the same material. Let's keep moving on. I want to finish up soon to allow time for questions. Now, let's think about Luke for a moment. Well, we see in Luke's gospel, we see Luke in the book of Acts, which he wrote, that he includes himself in the narrative. Now, this is, you can see this because at Acts chapter 16, verse 6, the narrative changes from Luke saying they did this and they did that, to Luke saying we did this and we did that. And so Luke's testimony changes at this point, and he includes himself in the narrative. And so when we see that, we can see that Luke was traveling with Paul for about 10 years. Okay, Luke gets involved with the Apostle Paul and he starts traveling. If we use that as the starting point, it could have been earlier, but it can't be later. It means that Luke is traveling with the Apostle Paul for about 10 years. Now we see this, don't we, in Paul's letters. So in Colossians, to Timothy and Philemon, Luke is mentioned as a missionary partner, a co-worker with the Apostle Paul. We're told in the book of Acts that Luke is still writing in the plural of we, and so Luke goes up to Jerusalem. So he's actually visiting the Jerusalem church. He's going back to where the testimony and everything's being taught and where it's all being proclaimed. Now, what does this mean? Well, what it means is that Luke is using this teaching of the Jerusalem church, the material that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's using that material for a decade with the Apostle Paul in ministry. Now, just think about that. Imagine if you worked with the Apostle Paul and the other disciples, the other apostles, but particularly Paul. You're with them and you're using the material that we have in the Gospels. You're using that in your ministry and using it to instruct churches and to plant churches, and you're passing it on and writing it out and distributing it amongst the churches. You're doing that for at least 10 years. Okay, you're doing it for at least 10 years. That's who Luke is. That's who Luke is. Luke's, he's not just like a journalist, right? He is a journalist who has to cover many stories. He is someone who is actively involved in ministry with the material that we have in the Gospels for 10 years with the Apostle Paul, and he's involved in their distribution amongst the churches and their teaching amongst the churches. He is a significant figure. So when he writes his gospel, he's not like a journalist who investigates many different stories and has to write something quickly. He's actually been using this material for years. He actually knows the original eyewitnesses in person, has been probably ministering with them, certainly with Paul, but he's been back in Jerusalem with the Jerusalem church. And so when he writes up his gospel, it's not just an outsider writing it up. It's not just like someone who's just learned about this quickly. It's someone actively involved with those who have been teaching this material and who are the original eyewitnesses. And so that's what the Gospel of Luke is. It contains the exact material of the testimony and teaching of the Jerusalem church. Now, what about Mark? I'll do this quickly because it's very similar. Well, Mark is even earlier than Luke. Mark is even earlier than Luke. So in Acts chapter 12, when Peter was in prison, the church gathered at Mark's house. Okay, so Mark is actually from the time of, like, from the location of Jesus. He's right there, and was most likely, there's no reason to believe that he wasn't one of those 100 that we read about in the book of Acts, who's right there at the time straight after Jesus. Mark, we read about from the very beginning in Acts 12, went on a mission with Barnabas and Paul. You remember that there was the disagreement about Mark, and that he left and went back for whatever reason. But he is there from the beginning. He's there with Peter from the very beginning in the Jerusalem church. He's in the first lot of missions that Paul and Barnabas do. And he too is included in Paul's letters in Colossians, to Timothy and Philemon, along with Luke. That is, Mark was actively involved in the mission. He's involved in the mission with Peter. He's involved in the mission with Paul. You can see how the early apostles and their companions are all working together. They're not in competition with each other. There's no evidence of that. They're actually co-workers together and working with each other. We also see that Mark is mentioned in 1 Peter 5:13. And so, as I said, he travels with Peter. Now, that is, Mark is using the teaching of the Jerusalem church in his ministry too. In fact, he is the Jerusalem church, right? So Mark is part of the Jerusalem church, and he's using this material in his ministry as he's out there with the disciples, with Paul and Peter, and he's there from the very beginning. Now, why is that important? Well, because Mark writes a gospel as well. And when Mark writes his gospel, he's not like a journalist who investigates. He's more than that. He's using material that he's writing up material that he's been using for decades in ministry with the apostles. And so the Gospel of Mark contains the exact material of the testimony and the teaching of the Jerusalem church. Now, Matthew is in the same style as Mark and Luke. And so Matthew comes from the same stock of witness and ministry. And it takes the name Matthew, and he was part of the Jerusalem church as well. And so just from its very composition, we can see that it originates from the apostles in Jerusalem church too. So to conclude, what does this mean for dating the Gospels? Well, people will say the Gospels were written, 80 AD or 90 AD or whatever they might say. They might give you some dates, 60s. Some will give, there's a wide range of dates that are put out there. Some will say much earlier, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But when they give these dates, it can create a false impression. It can create a false impression. Say even if you said 60 AD, like for a very early date. Say if you said the gospel was written 60 AD, that still creates the wrong impression, because people will say that and they'll go, Mark wasn't written till 60 AD. And it gives the impression that that's when Mark was first put on the scene and people started doing something with the material that we find in Mark. But what we see is that that's not the case. The material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is being used right from the very beginning in this exact form that we find in the Gospels. Now, the exact time at which they were written up and formalized into their final accounts, It's pretty hard to know those dates. But what we can say is the exact material that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we can date to at least 17 years at the latest after Jesus' ascension. And it most likely means that it's earlier than that. And so I just want to put that out there. When we think about the dating of the Gospels, we mustn't let that create the impression that that's when this material started. This material is there in its exact form from the very beginning. Now, there is a time when it's formalized into the Gospels that we have, but it's material that was being used in this exact form for decades beforehand. Sometimes people will say that Paul's letters were written before the Gospels. You'll read this in academic circles. People say the letters were written first, the Gospels later. Well, again, this is a false impression because Paul in his letters is quoting the Gospel material. And so the Gospel material predates Paul. Right? The Gospel material predates Paul. And as I've tried to show from the New Testament itself, we actually know a lot about what the apostles were doing if we just go to the New Testament. And so we don't need to go to the later church fathers. We need to go to the New Testament itself because we've got a lot of information there, which I've presented today. I just want to finish up by saying this, that you can be like the Apostle Paul. Because what did Paul do? Paul took the testimony of the Jerusalem church and used it in his preaching of the gospel. He used it in his building up of the churches. The exact material that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see Paul quoting in his letters. And so I want to encourage you to be using the Bible in your ministry, to be encouraging Muslims and everyone to be reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to be reading these Gospels, and obviously now knowing how to defend them, but getting them to read them and hear the testimony of Israel speaking to the world of what God has done in their midst through the person of Jesus. I'll finish up there, Eric and Carm.
Thanks, Samuel. So this is a vital topic when you consider that, as Samuel inferred, we're hearing one of the common objections from Muslims about the Bible is that it was constructed decades, maybe even a century after Jesus. And so we see from this presentation that no, that's not the case. So I love the evidence you presented. I would want to just open with Samuel. For instance, Corinthians, you said, was penned around 52 AD. So what is that from internal evidence, external biblical evidence, or a combination of both?
Thank you. Yes. Now, if you were to get books like, let me just get it for you here. Where's my book? So books like this one, An Introduction to the New Testament by Carson Moo Morris, got them there. So there are lots of these types of books around. They will take you through how the letters are dated. Now, the way that we do it with Paul's letters is that we have the book of Acts, and in the book of Acts, there are things that happen which we can date to outside of the Bible. For instance, in the book of Acts, it talks about one of the Roman emperors banishing the Jews from Rome. And we actually have that recorded outside of the Bible, and we know the date for it. And so when we know that date from outside the Bible, and then we read that event as part of Luke's narrative of, it's included in Luke's narrative for Apollos and Aquila and Apollos, and we know that they were with Paul, we all of a sudden have a date within the book of Acts. And there are a number of things like that. It will talk about different rulers, and we will know when those rulers were alive and when they ruled. And so we can plug those dates into the book of Acts, and the book of Acts records when Paul went to Corinth. And so we can know when he went to Corinth, and then, we can work things out from there. So it's the normal work of a historian, bringing together all the data. And in the case of the letters, we can do it fairly well.
So we can piece together a lot of this just by reading our Bible, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is the amazing thing. The Bible actually has a lot of information, and historians really get into the Bible. This is the thing. People think that historians just dismiss the Bible. That they don't. They absolutely don't. They take it very seriously, and historians, they're always quoting the Bible in other history. So just as we might use some of the Roman writings to date events in the book of Acts, if you go and read, say, the Cambridge World History and read the history of the Middle East and of the Roman period there, they're always quoting the Bible as well. So it's not just that we use non-biblical sources to help in our dating. They also use the Bible to help in general history's dating. So, the door swings both ways. Yep.
Excellent. All right. Okay. Carm, what do we have from the chat?
We have a very quiet chat today, but we do have, let's see. So we have this question here. Oh, wait, hold on. This one. This makes me think that Q doesn't exist. The apostles were just busy sharing their stories. I wonder if Reverend Green thinks Q exists or not.
Yes. Thank you for that question. So Q, I'll just explain that for others. Q is a summary of a German word, meaning I think it's Quelle or something like that, if my memory serves me correct. And it means source in German, it means source. And so what scholars have seen is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have similar material, right? And they've tried to divide up that material so that into its common sources. And I don't have any problem with that, because I believe there is a common source. It's the testimony of the Jerusalem church. And so they've got one particular section which they called Q, and they want to say that that they can identify Q. They can by looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they can identify it. And so the question that's been raised here by Professor Yaffel is, do we even know if Q exists? Well, that is a question that you could raise in the light of what I'm saying, right? I guess I'd want to say that it could well exist, but I would want to place it within the context of the ministry of the Jerusalem church, along with other things, because as I said, the Jerusalem church gets on with its task. They're starting to write scripture, and they're consciously writing scripture as prophets, and this material is coming out. So Q, I want to say that yes, there are sources there, so I don't just want to dismiss it, but how much I want to then use that to prove other things. I want to come back to what we can say and say that the Jerusalem church sees itself with a prophetic role, testifying to Jesus, and it's doing this through the production of this witness, which we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay, thank you. And we have a comment, and this is just praising you that it's a brilliant way to explain the dating nonchalantly of the skeptic.
Thank you. Yeah, and look, again, we need to break it down so that it's accessible to Christians, and that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to show you that you actually have a lot of info right at your fingertips.
I feel like even though they have all of this, like we can produce this, but some people are they just don't want to believe it, or they find other excuses. Like once you show them this, and then it'll be something else.
Well, it may well be, but at least it won't be this. I think we need to have a good answer for this, just for Christians as well, because I don't want Christians being deceived and not being confident in their faith. When I actually think just from a purely historical point of view, we can be very confident, that the apostles of Jesus got on with the task, and what they produced is exactly what we have today.
Yeah.
And what I'm also hoping is that when people do challenge us, you can say to them, what's your evidence? Right? And so now you're going to have some evidence to engage with, and they're going to have to provide some evidence, because very often they just don't provide any evidence. Right? They'll just say scholars say, and you say, well, hang on, okay, well, what's the evidence for that? Here's my evidence. Show me what your scholars are saying. And, you know,
That's true.
you
and I
now
like
know the evidence.
I like your point that Luke wasn't just watching from the sidelines and taking notes as he was, interviewing people. He was on the field himself.
Yeah.
And knew a lot of the main players in the gospel proclamation.
Yeah, I mean, an example I can give is, so I wrote this book. Okay, I wrote this book, but I was using this material for decades in ministry, in debates, face-to-face, in training. I used it for decades before I came to write that book. Now, when you read the book, is it that, when the book's published, that's when it starts, that's when the material begins? Well, no, it's actually got decades, it's got 30 years of history, but it happens to be written now. And this is what we have with the Gospels, that they're being used, the exact material's being used, but, of course, there has to be a time when it's written up, and we've got 3 examples of it being written up, probably for different missionary purposes.
Okay, so our chat is quiet now, huh? You've silenced them, Samuel. Well, here's a comment.
Thank you very much, 4749er. Is that an American football team or something?
I'm guessing, yes.
Okay. Oh,
49ers.
49ers, the 49ers or something.
Okay, well, if you enjoyed Samuel Green, just a reminder, he's with us about once a month on these live streams, and then he'll be also at our Strong Tower Conference, September 9th through 11th. Wanted to remind you again, you can start registering for that this Wednesday at ministrytomuslims.com. So June 1st, that registration opens. So, and we'll look forward to having you in Southern California, Samuel.
I look forward to being there and, catching up with everyone and joining in the work of the gospel.
Great. Okay, Carm, thanks again. And thanks again, Samuel. And everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.